Welcome everyone to our first in the series of Business School Alliance for Health Management, BAM virtual series webinars, just highlighting the futures and the lessons learned from many different innovations and healthcare system disruptions, if you may say, related to COVID. In this webinar, we have a great panel who will tell you about the Coventor, its development implications and lessons learned. My name is Pinar Karaca-Mandic. I'm a professor at the finance department at Carlson School of Management, and I'm also the academic director of the Medical Industry Leadership Institute at the Carlson School. With me, I have Art Erdman from University of Minnesota, Jim Kleneidler from Boston Scientific, Mike Hess from Medtronic, and David Cook from UnitedHealth Group. I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists before we start, but I also wanted to say a few words about BAM, Business School Alliance for Health Management. BAM was actually founded approximately 10 years ago to support its member schools and their faculty, students, and graduates in leveraging their expertise on behalf of US and global healthcare organizations. The 20 members of BAM comprise leading US and global business schools with health sector focus, and members are now located all across the United States, Canada, Latin America, Europe, and Africa. BAM member schools are committed to cultivating and promoting a solid understanding of healthcare management, policy, and innovation through educational collaborations, research, and other initiatives. We, through BAM, publish an online journal, Health Management Policy and Innovation, HMPI.org, featuring articles by scholars and practitioners worldwide about healthcare policy and business decision making. Currently, with the COVID, HMPI also includes a very high visibility blog on management-based solutions to COVID-19 related challenges, featuring very interesting case studies. The webinar series that we have now is a series in the latest example of BAM's commitment to drive and shape discussions in innovative business of healthcare solutions. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelist, David Cook from UnitedHealth Group. David is the Vice President and Senior Research Fellow for the Physician Executive Group at UnitedHealth Group Research and Development. Dr. Cook leads a team that guides research, develops points of view to inform UAG strategy, and conducts proof of concept clinical studies related to healthcare service design and innovation. His group also offers reviews and informs assessment of new technologies and companies for partnership, and works with industry and academic medical centers to advance health system and clinical service design. Before UAG, Dr. Cook served as the Chief Clinical Officer at Jiahui Health in Shanghai between 2016 and 19. And before that, from 1992 to 2016, Dr. Cook was a Professor of Emeritus at Mayo Medical School, and he's an anesthesiologist and with an appointment in the section of systems engineering. Dr. Arthur Erdman, from the Earl E. Bakken Medical Devices Center from the University of Minnesota, is the Richard C. Jordan Professor and a distinguished teaching professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Minnesota, specializing in mechanical design, bioengineering, and product design. He's also the director of the Medical Devices Center at the University of Minnesota, and was also the co-founding editor of the ASME Journal of Medical Devices. Next, we have Mike Hess. Mike is the VP of Corporate Technology and Innovation and has been with Medtronic for over 30 years, leading a corporate science and technology organization. Mike is focused on identifying and prioritizing early stage technology programs to advance therapy innovation. At Medtronic, Mike has worked in a wide range of leadership roles, including R&D management, corporate research and technology, program management, upstream marketing, clinical, and general management for Brady and heart failure therapies. And Jim Kleneidler in Boston Scientific was actually a former FDA device reviewer with a background in engineering and biomaterials toxicology. Jim is a regulatory affairs fellow at Boston Scientific, where he leads a team that develops cohesive strategies for early stage technologies that recognize shared needs across regulatory, clinical, and reimbursement. Okay, so with that introduction, I would like to start with Art, and I want to ask him about the Coventor, how it originated at the University of Minnesota, what it does, and what does it look like?
Thanks, Pinar, and thanks for MILI for putting together this webinar. I've been looking forward to it. Yes, if you can put up, got a couple of slides here that show the amazing history of this. Next slide, please. So the idea originated with Steve Richardson, who is a MD in anesthesiology. Over the weekend, he realized, and this was in the day that we had no idea what the need would be for ventilators. And he understood that there was a need for a low low cost, minimal functionality ventilator that would substitute for someone that would be a loved one, perhaps, that would be pushing on the AMU bag, which you see in the picture there. It's the blue bag. And so he contacted a friend that worked at MGC Diagnostics in Vadnais Heights. And in a 3-hour period, they cobbled up together in a, you can see a red toolbox there. They cobbled this together and developed a working prototype based on a very simple mechanism. That began the process for the University of Minnesota and the Medical Devices Center. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I got an email from him on the 16th, and we started working that day. And with collaboration from many people on this panel, in 30 days, this received FDA approval in record time. On day 16, there was an initial meeting of the University of Minnesota, UnitedHealth, and Boston Scientific. And 2 days later, Boston Scientific just started their race, which was both a race and a marathon at the same time, same as us. Next slide shows a brief picture of the early CAD rendering of the Coventor. That was done by my grad students, very talented people. And on the right-hand side, you see the breathing circuit that includes the white MU bag and the endotracheal tube that goes down. And the idea was, can we develop a design and put it into practice, get FDA approval, and get it on the market? And that's what kicked off nearly 24/7 activity for those 3 days. Pinar, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, yes, no, thank you so much, Art. And for that introduction and how the idea originated. It's pretty impressive. In 30 days, FDA approval, probably not, I don't know if it's unheard of, but definitely a very, very unique situation. Jim, would you like to take it next and tell us a little bit about how Boston Scientific get involved with the project and how did the partnership evolve? And then I think I would love if Mike and then David also comment on the same question about the role of their organization and their involvement. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Pinar. So I just want to start off by expressing gratitude to the development team at Boston Scientific and the Minnesota Coalition that's represented on this panel, as well as Hogan Lovells and FDA for just the commitment and the urgency that I don't think any of us have experienced on any other new product development. at the end of January, President declared a public health emergency. And then March 24th is when FDA released a emergency use authorization for ventilators due to concerns around availability and access to ventilators in the healthcare space, at centers across the country where they were seeing high transmission rates. So this emergency use authorization, which I'll mention later, it's a different mechanism by which FDA will allow unapproved devices to be used on a temporary basis during a public health emergency. Now, 4 days after FDA issued that emergency use authorization, University of Minnesota submitted an application for Coventor. And then that evening of Saturday, March 28th, there was a project kickoff with 24 folks across BSC, Medtronic, UHG, and University of Minnesota. And I know Randy Schistel, who's our VP of Global Tech, was vocal in BSC's interest in playing a lead role in trying to get patients access to this device. And BSC, we don't normally develop respirators and ventilators, but we did have manufacturing capability due to some of the slowing in elective procedures during the pandemic. And so we were committed to resource this, as needed to meet the urgent timelines. And so we ended up being legal manufacturer for the product, which meant that we took the design from University of Minnesota and then worked with them and Medtronic to make tweaks for manufacturability. And then ultimately we built and delivered 3,000 units to UHG for distribution. And then lastly, we were listed as regulatory co-sponsors for the emergency use authorization, which, as Art mentioned, was approved very expeditiously.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Do you want to tell us about Medtronic's involvement and the part that the Medtronic's responsibilities in the Coventor designs?
Sure. So thank you. And I think Medtronic's interest was very complementary to the ones you've already heard about, because we had an opposite problem. We were obviously in the ventilator business already. We had already at this point committed to double our ventilator production from our own facilities in Galway, and we had been making major changes for that to happen. And we had already decided to release ventilator specs. We released the previous generation ventilator specs in public domain. The last time I checked in, there had already been over 100,000 downloads of those specifications, which are quite detailed down to the source code. So anyone with the right technical abilities can make their own ventilators. What this meant was we had tons of engagements coming at us requesting partnerships. We had big companies, small companies, universities, labs, everyone coming saying, let us help you make ventilators. We can make ventilators. Here's a design. Everyone wants to work with us to get ventilators out the door. And so we had to be very selective in who we worked with, because our ventilator business is not that big as far as Medtronic goes. It's in a handful of really experts. And so we ended up triaging and really prioritizing these approaches that were coming into Medtronic to figure out what's the most valuable engagements we can have as far as products that seem the most ready to move on and that could have the biggest impact in meeting the surge capacity that the healthcare system was going to need for ventilators. And Coventor definitely hit the mark there as far as having the design expertise from the university, UnitedHealth Group there with a strong market need, understanding of what the demands were, and then Boston Scientific there with their resources ready to jump on it. So we were able to put our engineering know-how and ventilator expertise into the mix as well to increase chance of success. And we're really happy to see the project get to this point where we developed this this product that would have that disruptive surge capacity to kind of handle the potential for overrunning the existing supply of ventilators.
No, thank you so much. And Kim, thanks for playing the video for us and how the Coventor works, the designs of it and how it functions. So far then we heard from Art, the engineering and the idea. I believe one of the University of Minnesota anesthesiologists brings the idea, teams up with Bakken Medical Devices Center and the engineers. Boston Scientific takes on more of the manufacturing piece of it, and Medtronic is supplementing with the design improvements. And David, would you like to tell us about UHG and UHG's story and how you guys got involved?
Yeah, of course. UHG is often thought of as an insurance company, but we're really a global health company. Sort of a tiger team was developed really early in COVID, and being an anesthesiologist intensivist and looking at the changes in viral spread and the severity of illness across the world, we were charged with identifying potential ventilatory solutions that would support any healthcare need in the U.S. or in our international operations, which is 55 hospitals in Latin America. We began looking at all of the non-invasive kinds of technologies that existed really back in about February, anticipating there was going to be global needs, trying to project where those needs were going to be around the world. Decided that the non-invasive ventilatory strategies were not going to be sufficient. So started to survey all the ventilatory technologies sort of around the world, and the approaches that physicians and intensivists were taking. We looked at technologies developing in Asia, in Italy, in Spain, in the UK, and here in the US. And fortuitously, the Coventor design turned up, and we joined that early meeting in March. Importantly, as we reviewed the potential ventilatory technologies that might be brought to bear, we made the decision that based on where we were seeing the surges across the US and what we anticipated, particularly in South America, we needed a design that could be produced in 30 days. And really the Coventor, of all of the different ventilatory strategies that were being set up around the world, the Coventor was really the only one that we thought that could meet that expectation. So one of the things, we did was, one, make a commitment that we would take responsibility for the purchase of these, help coordinate the intercompany leadership communications to get commitments, but really focus on getting a commitment from all the stakeholders. We'd be able to produce this thing in 30 days to be able to meet the needs. We saw that companies that might produce them in 60, 90, or 120 days were going to effectively miss the real high demand for these. So that was a core commitment to this.
No, thank you so much. So, 30 days production, that's a very ambitious metric to live up to. I think that maybe offers a good opportunity for those of the participants in the audience who may not be very familiar with the typical product cycle of a medical technology, medical device. Jim, Mike, would you like to maybe comment on what is a typical product cycle in Boston Scientific, in Medtronic, and how this particular technology really differed from it in some ways?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I can. I'll make just a couple quick comments. So generally, you have large buckets, right, of design, kind of manufacture, packaging, labeling, storage, distribution, and I think one of the unique features of this program was that FDA allowed us waivers for regulations governing a lot of those processes through this accelerated emergency use authorization. And so, BSC, obviously we operate with a quality system that's fully compliant to the good manufacturing processes and then the normal kind of steps we would go through. But with this EUA, we were able to scale our internal processes a bit. we didn't follow to the letter all of our SOPs and work instructions, but we consider the essential elements and kind of the critical risks. But I think the main theme for this project was pragmatism, and that we still had a history file that laid out user needs and controls and risk analysis and all of our verifications, but we were able to go about it in a more lean way. For example, we used labeling to mitigate a good number of risks on this. We used some qualitative instead of quantitative risk assessments. There was a lot of administrative efficiencies. We didn't follow all of our corporate templates. A lot of things were just put on plain Word documents, like the instructions for use. And so it was a simplified process, and that's what allowed us to meet that 30-day time frame from first build to completion of all the commercial units.
I don't say from Medtronic's standpoint, a typical fast turn project might be more in the order of 18 months, and I think part of it's that we have some very deliberate kind of review stage gate activities that happen where everyone kind of comes together and kind of beats up on the design a little bit and tests it for their own areas of expertise to make sure that it's going to meet the design requirements fully. And sometimes those, we do a lot more testing than we would in a project like this, because that product is a much bigger investment, or it may have to last a lot longer. The requirements are usually a little bit more stringent. So it required suspending some of those normal behaviors to get to this point. And I think that, as Jim said, there's things you can do around labeling and around setting expectations to make it okay to do that. It also required us to put aside some things that everyone believes a ventilator has to have, right? Because we've been designing these for a long time, so they're quite sophisticated. They've got alarms and remote controls and all kinds of things like that. And the folks who are experts in this field for 20 years have to suddenly say, okay, you know what? The stuff I've been working on for the last decade to get into this market no longer matters in this crisis moment where we have to have a surge capacity. And so that's another interesting challenge, is to set aside things that everyone takes as requirements. It'd be like designing a car and saying, what do you mean there's no air conditioning and there's no radio and you don't need windows? It's like, maybe of course you need windows. And so having that level of disruption and thinking with a clean slate can be hard for folks. But I think that was another aspect of this, besides the speed, was just the ability just to put aside things we take for granted as no longer required.
Thank you, both Jim and Mike. Art, do you want to add on to those comments from the Bakken Medical Devices Center perspective? And you've been years in in the field of product development, and did you envision this happening so fast, and this collaboration and the different types of product development that we've seen with Coventor?
Not at all. I've never seen anything like it. I've also consulted in industry and so forth. It's amazing what people do when there's an emergency or something that is out of the ordinary. And so there is, yes, the ability to get around normal processes, but it takes a 24/7 attitude. And I know at Boston Scientific that happened as well. I'm totally amazed at how many people wanted to join this activity. Once it got a little publicity, I was getting emails every half hour. And I think we have a database of 650 people and companies that wanted to contribute, which is phenomenal. It shows how human nature has such great qualities. But at the same time, we had to focus. As Mike was saying, you have to decide what is going to be part of it and what isn't. And the supply chain came together so quickly. It's totally amazing, because you can have the best design in the world if you don't have the supply chain ready to go. So making those decisions was amazing. I hope we never have to do something like this again. But if we do, we've learned a lot about how to do things. And of course, there's politics involved in all of our organizations, and having the leadership at the university, particularly in our tech transfer office, get through all the paperwork. I mean, we opened, one of the nice things is we made this open source. So that made a lot of things easier, but not easy. So, and I'm sure that all our organizations that had to there was some arm twisting that had to happen.
Thank you. David, I know you and I had conversations about supply chain and all the unique challenges that UAG had to go through to make this project a possibility as well. Would you like to say a few words about that?
I certainly would for this audience. And I want to comment on something else first that kind of emphasizes what Art and Mike said. It was a remarkable thing to be on a phone call with the CEOs of UHG, Medtronic, and Boston Scientific, and just hear those three individuals say, you know, we are going to do this, we are going to proceed, we're not going to worry about paperwork, we're not going to worry right now about purchase orders, we're just going to do this. And that 20-minute phone call really was inspiring to have these leaders come together and just completely make the commitment. So everything starts with a commitment, and it was a commitment to each other in spite of being different companies in different aspects of healthcare. It was a commitment to that kind of an aggressive timeline. It was a commitment to do whatever is required to get this done, both for manufacturing, design, and regulatory. I would call out to this audience a challenge that we had. The Coventor device is really so basic that, as Mike said, it doesn't have traditional safety features, and it was necessary to capture at least some safety features that would be normally required in respiratory devices in the actual breathing circuit, that bit of plastic that Art showed at the beginning of the call. Quite a bit of safety can be introduced there through the introduction of pop-off valves, through the introduction of viral filters, to the introduction of manometers, a variety of things like that, humidifiers. And so some of the intelligence of the whole thing ended up in the breathing circuit component rather than in the mechanical component. Sourcing the airway component, the plastic disposable part, was a real challenge to source. In some ways, it's more complicated than the Coventor device itself, and we ran into some serious supply chain problems. We were on phone calls with Denmark, with Malaysia, with California, with Florida, to try to source the parts to be able to assemble enough breathing circuits to go with the Coventors. And one of the things I'd like to call out to this group is that part of the problem is that the parts are not compatible. We could buy parts from Ambu in the UK, or I'm sorry, in Denmark. We could buy circuit components from Florida. We could get filters from Medtronic, but they didn't fit together. And from the standpoint, I certainly, as companies, proprietary technologies are important, but in this circumstance, we managed to hobble stuff together. But I would call on medical industry broadly to be conscious of these sorts of things, anticipate different sorts of national emergencies in the future, and think about at least some compatibilities in design that would allow us to more rapidly address these kinds of challenges in the future.
Okay. That's definitely an important lesson learned from the entire experience. Jim and Mike, do you have similar stories to share from your organizations as to some of the unique challenges that you have faced?
In regards to Coventor, yeah, I think we ended up, as I mentioned before, kind of creating almost like a front end, a triage to all of the inputs coming to Medtronic, just as Art described. 600 people kind of coming, trying to get involved. We had everyone, we had boat manufacturers coming, asking to make ventilators. We had all kinds of people from different industries bringing their expertise or trying to bring their expertise into this need space. And so, prioritizing the kind of engagement of the technical experts to work on the Coventor was part of it. We talked already about the requirements, and I think we had a similar, we had to pick in with the Medtronic as far as how much we engaged, right? So we made a decision early on that we were not going to manufacture them, right? It was an opportunity we had, and we thought, what, Boston Scientific has got this. They're going to create the pilot, the first run of this. It's going to be an open source, so other companies can do this. Given our commitments in the ventilator space already to double production, we don't have that surplus capacity right now in this area of expertise to make these. And so we had to have an internal discussion about whether it made sense or not. Ultimately, we decided, no, we're going to focus our efforts where we can make the biggest difference and the biggest help. But certainly, I was also, as Art said, I was very impressed by how the supply chain came together, because that can be one of the biggest challenges, just as we struggled with doubling our production and going to our vendors and asking them to start making twice as many components and twice as many circuits and all the parts that we assemble for these complicated devices, to go out and look for all these bags, for example, and all these housing components so quickly with the quality you need for a medical device is really challenging.
Jim? Yeah.
So I might add that one of the unique learnings and maybe a potential barrier to future emergency use authorizations is who is the sponsor of the technology from a regulatory standpoint, because like I said, 4 days after the emergency use authorization was issued, University of Minnesota put in their application, and we didn't receive any communication from the agency for like a week or 10 days. And it was concerning because, we were all racing to build as many of these as possible and getting supply chains set up. And, but without, the authorization, there's no way that patients could get access to this. And so we were obviously going after some pretty immediate timelines. So we were able to reach out to the leadership reviewing this application, and it turns out that the application was triaged. It was placed in a lower priority because a university was sponsoring it. And it's not an indictment on the University of Minnesota by any means, but they get a lot of applications. They were inundated with applications from academic centers, from industry, from different universities, and it turns out they were prioritizing applications that were from sponsors with a 13485 compliant manufacturing site, or they had manufacturing capability to actually make a significant difference to sites that were just suffering from access and availability of ventilators. If you have a university that can only generate 10 of these, a week, it's not going to make that big of a difference. And so that's when, so we made it clear that Boston Scientific is, going to co-sponsor this application, that we have the ability to crank these out. I think initial targets were 50 per day, and then we were up to 300 per day. And so that made a big difference then in how we were reviewed. And I think once the review started, it took 4 days to complete, so, and that was a 24/7 sort of commitment from both sides. And so it was pretty unique, that sort of interaction and that sort of just frequency of telling us, laying out exactly what they needed to make this, to get the approval through.
Yes, you being on the regulatory side at the FDA as well, so this time you experienced, I guess, from the Boston Scientific perspective, how that regulation process works. And so so we can talk more about the regulation, but I wanted to maybe go around, maybe start with Art, and then go around maybe David, Mike, and then Jim, about if you were to sort of highlight, several key factors that were really, that made this project and partnership a success. If you could highlight some of the key things from your perspectives, that'll be great.
Yeah, thanks, Pinar. I would say that the success of this started many years ago. You don't start from scratch having these relationships. So we have wonderful relationships through Randy Schistel and others at Boston Scientific and Medtronic. The other thing is that the Bakken Medical Devices Center is used to doing this, not at this speed. No one was ready to do it at this speed, but fortunately we had graduate students that were doing product design based on unmet needs, and we have a lab and machine shop and things like that. We also had Dean Tolar of the medical school willing to allow 70 students that were undergraduate students that already had worked in the center to come in an emergency situation and build 25 units. We also had an IRB and a system that allowed us to do 4 animal trials. I think, if anything, that put us ahead of other competing low functionality respirators. It was because we had already done animal trials. So the relationships were already there. I don't think there are many states in the country that could have done this because the relationships and the trust was already there.
Thank you so much. Actually, before I move to maybe David, I would ask the audience, and this may be a good time to send your questions to us that we can build into sort of the Q&A part towards the end of the panel. So you could use the chat function to write your questions, and I'll try to direct them to the panelists as best as I can. Thank you. Yeah, David, if you could please tell us your perspective of the key factors to success.
So I mentioned one already. I think the most important thing was commitment. Commitment from the highest levels of leadership of the organization that we were going to do this. I think the second thing is that setting a clear timeline and saying this was going to be 30 days framed the work for all of these organizations. And in the absence of that, things tend to drift. There's a culture around, how this kind of work happens, and saying that the absolute requirement was 30 days was instrumental in making this happen. And then I think the third thing, and Mike and Art have both referred to this, is we were able to really effectively determine accountability for this project. Medtronic has certain expertise, Boston Scientific has expertise, UHG has certain expertise, and dividing the work and allowing that expertise to express itself to drive those functions within this project were absolutely essential. And I want to just say something else about relationships. Our relationships have changed between our organizations as a result of this. As a result of how effective, in particular, our relationship with Boston Scientific was, we're going to be pursuing additional collaborative work with them. And it really makes sense that the largest payer in the United States, outside of the government, would work with a company like Boston or Medtronic to really try to develop new technologies to bring them into the marketplace, because we understand the market, we understand what our clients' needs are, we understand what healthcare needs are, and bringing our understanding together with innovation at Boston or innovation at Medtronic, I think is going to allow us to accelerate the delivery of products and services to the marketplace in the future.
Mike, Jim.
Yeah, one thing I would say is I think it highlighted maybe for the medical device industry more broadly the opportunities for companies without medical device expertise to participate. We tend to think of it as a fairly insular and fairly specialized niche market that requires a lot of commitments to build, either components of the quality we need or components that are relatively small volume for other industries comparisons. And yet, in this space, we saw a lot of companies kind of, volunteer to help and offer, and suddenly we've got, Tesla and Foxconn and companies like that participating with Medtronic, making components that we otherwise couldn't find. I think the ability of Boston Scientific to quickly ramp up a production line with no ventilator experience prior to that, but to knowing the medical device manufacturing requirements and having the design spec to work off and quickly participate was impressive as well. So I think it highlights that in a period of intense crisis and prioritization, you can throw the net much wider than we might normally be used to throwing it, to get the resources and participants you need to be successful.
And I might just add two things. So one, you don't meet these accelerated timelines without lots of nights and weekends, right? So I think it was a huge commitment from the staff that were working on this, and I think people were motivated because they understood the clinical impact that this could have. There was an enormous promise for this to impact human health in a way that was just so acute and so visible that it wasn't hard to get people to volunteer and spend nights and weekends on something like this. So I think, in terms of a future learning, just making sure that teams understand the clinical impact of the technologies you're working on, along with, the financial impact of why we're prioritizing something, but just understanding the human impact of it may go a long way in motivating folks and aligning folks on an objective. And then the second thing I was going to mention was this was a great case study for seeing how we can move quickly by empowering individuals. As folks on the panel will know, normally in a typical new product development, you have a core team. You may have a franchise level. You have business level. You might have corporate level, governance. And all of these have responsibility for review and recommendations and decision-making. And so, while some oversight is needed, it can kind of inhibit swift and efficient decision-making. So what we did in this project is just kind of go do it. We'll pivot if it doesn't work. And so it really allowed us to collapse some of that bureaucracy and move quickly.
No, thank you so much. So before we wrap up, I want to get at sort of the more general lessons again, but I wanted to also blend in one question that came from the chat function, which I'll kind of add to this. If you could maybe comment on the status of the project, and also can you briefly describe the logistics of getting this product to hotspots? David, I don't know if you wanted to take that question.
Sure. Yeah, this actually was a bit of a challenge for us because we don't do distribution. So we had to figure out a way to take these ventilators, get them to a location, combine them with all of these thousands and thousands of pieces of breathing circuitry, get those put together in ways that they were usable, and then have means to get them to our international operations. So, and then we also had to deal with some of the regulatory challenges in different countries that we were using these ventilators for. So, getting them, it's a remarkable thing to get the ventilators manufactured, but there's a long tail in getting this work done and getting these things moved around. It wasn't something we've had experience with. So that was new to us as well.
Thank you. There was another question that we received about the cost of production, if you produce at mass scale, if any of the presenters, panelists could comment on that briefly.
Yeah, so this was, again, unique in that there was no patentability. You know, all of the design was open source. There's no profit. We were manufacturing and selling these at cost. So I think the cost of goods was about $1,000, and so that's what we were selling them then for. So yeah, that's where we're at on cost.
Because this is an audience through BAM, Business School Alliance for Health Management, one of the questions that we get that I would love for each of the panelists to please say a few words on is, could this be the basis of how we should do innovation in the future? Any of the main success factors we can take into the future, and how can we prepare future executives, and primarily, of course, the perspective here is more for MBA students, for this new way of innovating?
Can I take a pass at something? This is David. So we've made a change in how we're thinking about development, new technologies, new partnerships. In the past, we had a lot of companies come to us with ideas and asking, you know, how does UHG think about this technology, this business application, etc., among our, you know, tens of millions of clients. That really wasn't very effective, because very often startups would design products that really wouldn't quite match up with what we needed. So our new approach is actually to invite venture companies into UHG in seminars, and we will sit down for a day with a group of 10, 14 venture companies and outline for them our leading ideas, where we think healthcare is going and where the priorities are, and provide our priorities to venture companies for them to look at startups for investments rather than the other way around. And we think this is ultimately going to be a more effective way of getting the types of products and services that we need and to innovate in more rapid ways. Again, as I mentioned earlier with Boston, matching what we identify as the needs of our population with targeted technologies in that space, rather than just have all kinds of things come at us from all over the place. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, again, I think that it's an interesting case study from the example of how a company thinks about portfolio management. I mean, neither Medtronic nor Boston, you know, could have turned their entire companies over to a project with this much risk or uncertainty, right? I mean, it was, you know, so you wouldn't have, you know, I mean, Boston, as Jim said, they had manufacturing capacity because of the slowdown of elective procedures, so they had some resources available. Medtronic had expertise we could apply to this. If you'd asked those same CEOs, we need you to stop producing everything you do right now and do only this for the next 2 months, they would have had to say no, because that would have been over investing, oversubscribed, or over indexed. And so portfolio management, really thinking about how many efforts, how many resources you throw at a project like this, how much effort, how long do you let it go, you know, how much room do you give the team, the degrees of freedom that David described, where the CEO said, we're going to get this done, we're not going to worry about the bureaucracy, paperwork stuff. You know, that's a great way to operate under certain conditions for a while. So I think it gives you, you know, some experience to show that, yeah, it's okay for big companies that are used to process and rigor and bureaucracy to take a chance sometimes and to operate differently when they've got, you know, kind of the team's got the right boundaries around it about what their needs are, what their goals are.
Art and Jim, do you want to add on?
So I think this was, again, unique because you oftentimes don't see commercial, you know, a collaboration like this across industry in a commercial space. I mean, you see it mainly across standard development or different consortiums or working groups, you know, for guidance documents or something like that. But The fact that, we were selling this at cost, that again, there's no patentability issues. It just really was a great environment to learn from each other. We had a lot of design reviews throughout, I think we had 4 design reviews in April. So we were able to bring our heads together and kind of learn from each other and make sure everybody was aligned. And I think it really went a long ways towards getting us to where we were at the end of this.
I could briefly add, in over 40 years involved in innovative projects and things like that, it really has to do with very quick decision making that's wise and well informed. And that's an experience that we don't do very well at the university or in companies. I've always liked Skunk Works, where you pull together very talented team, a broad spectrum team, for a finite amount of time to solve a problem. And I've had the opportunity to do that with some industries a while back. I think we should go back to that a little bit more, get that kind of experience. So you can, and they have some hackathons and things like that around, but I think that kind of experience will, for many wannabe entrepreneurs, prepare them for this rapid decision making that we had in this project.
No, thank you. I mean, I think I heard from every single one of you saying how this project itself challenged the notion of how fast we can move pretty much in every stage of the technology development and getting it to the consumers directly. There's a lot of the times the medical device industry presumably moves fairly slow, due to quality, safety, and conservatism, type of considerations. And of course, this operation during the pandemic showed how fast we can move. So I think maybe concluding remarks, we have just a few minutes left on, do you think this kind of speed and efficiency will stick after the pandemic, or will business return to sort of typical processes and model? Or what would be sort of your comfort, your sweet spot from your organization's standpoint?
Well, I would just say that for disease states where there's very poor prognosis and where patients have very few alternatives, it makes sense to leverage, the learnings from this program in terms of how to move fast, how to produce something that's more of a minimal viable product versus maybe with something that's an optimal design. And use pragmatism and risk-based approaches for decision making. So I think it taught us, how to remove some of the barriers that oftentimes will slow us down, whether those are external or internal with different silos between businesses or functions. And so for breakthrough types of devices, I think it makes a lot of sense to apply a very similar kind of scaled approach to what we saw here with Coventor.
Sorry, there is one more question that came up, which is, I guess it's going to be our very last question. How will this pandemic change the industry? More mergers and acquisitions, or more concentration in special areas which will help in the speed? And what should we focus in the future, and join startup companies or stay with those large players?
Yeah, a couple of things that come to mind. I mentioned one already earlier, and that is that we have more collaborators available to us than we might have otherwise thought, and other companies that service other industries might find that healthcare is actually something they can actually engage with they wouldn't have thought otherwise. And so that's probably created some new connections, just as David described, new connections to the industry from UHG's perspective. I think we have other opportunities get other companies that can manufacture parts for us and components and then participate that otherwise we wouldn't have had access to. And the second one, I think, is that there's some, stepping aside from Coventor for a moment, at the broad kind of COVID level interest around things like remote management of patients and telehealth and some of those that have been driven out of a necessity to keep people out of hospitals who are not sick are now, I think, going to have the opportunity to highlight the efficiencies of care that might come with doing things that way, and maybe patient preference around doing that as well, which will then trigger technology investments to make those even richer experiences. It will trigger reimbursement and economic assessments, and it'll create a burning platform for things that were done out of necessity to be, I don't know, just perpetuated for efficiencies and market and patient preference perspectives. That's what I suspect. So I think we'll see more focus on how can you take whatever technology you're doing and make it remotely accessible, remotely available, easier to use, more efficient, so we're more flexible and nimble in the future about how we deliver care.
I would echo Mike's comments. Healthcare is never going to be the same, particularly as we move to different delivery models like telehealth. We're going to increasingly see healthcare delivered in the home. We're going to progressively see the application of technologies, whether they're software technologies or device technologies, that are going to increasingly allow patients and our clients to do self-assessment, self-reporting. Those kinds of things will ultimately reduce costs and allow us to scale in ways that face-to-face visits with physicians or advanced practice nurses will never be able to do.
Thank you. I think we're out of time exactly. It's 11 o'clock here in Minneapolis. I would like to thank the audience as well as every single one of our panelists very much for your time. First of all, for your work on Coventor and for making a project such unique possible and in the hands of people who need it. And on behalf of the Medical Industry Leadership Institute, MILI, as well as the Business School Alliance for Health Management, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this really amazing experience with us. Thank you.